Welcome to Talent Matters, the podcast where talent, skills and grit take centre stage. I'm Donal O'Donoghue and this is episode 35. The podcast is sponsored by Sanderson, talent solutions that transform businesses globally. Today I'm delighted to have a guest with us who is a psychologist, an author and now a podcaster as well, and she's our first returning guest. Dr. Denise O'Dwyer, welcome back.
Thanks so much, Donal. Great to be here.
You were with us for episode 10 back in April, and now you're here again for episode 35 to continue the conversation.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Super honoured. Thanks a million for having me.
Delighted to see you back. What we wanted to do was, obviously there was very positive feedback on your episode, and then people wanted to kind of continue the conversation. So that's why I've invited you back. We've loads to talk about, but I might actually work in reverse order in terms of what you and I have just discussed. So let's start off with your podcast because you've decided to launch one.
Yeah.
Tell us a little about it and why.
Yeah, so it's the same name, Psychologist with Sparkle, so the same name as my book. And I just did my first episode last month. So I'll be doing one episode per month. And it's kind of just a continuation, really, of my book. I suppose a lot of people, as you'll know, are not readers. And even though I kind of tried to present the message in the book in as kind of an accessible manner as possible, people are still, a lot of people just prefer audio. I suppose it's just easier for them if they're driving or whatever to listen as opposed to read something. So I suppose a lot of the kind of themes that I talked about in my book, I'll be kind of diving into a bit further and bringing on guests and stuff like that. So I'm excited. Yeah. So
sounds brilliant. I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into it. And it's kind of interesting because when we launched this podcast, I thought this was going to be very much a business and kind of careers podcast. And there's an element of that, but so much of it is about personal development and struggle and determination and managing adversity to get people to their destination. So there seems to be a huge appetite for that. So I'm sure there'll be a huge appetite for your podcast as well.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And we will share all of the details as well in our show notes.
Brilliant.
But what I wanted to talk to you about, the first thing I suppose that I wanted to talk to you about is many people in our audience are in that kind of 35 to 55 kind of age bracket. And one of the things that we touched on a little bit in the last episode with you was navigating different life challenges and life stages. So one of the first ones were, I suppose, around navigating breakups. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that people are facing, going through kind of breakups and divorce and that kind of thing, and how to navigate some of those challenges.
There's, like I often say, that a lot of my work is to do with like breaking down relationships or relationships that have broken down. And I suppose in terms of the challenges that present, that's obviously, the duration of the relationship, the intensity of the relationship. They're all huge factors, I suppose, in terms of like the different things that present for people. So obviously, I mean, if you're living with somebody, if you have family with them, or you're with them for a long time, that's obviously going to present a hell of a lot more challenges than if you've just recently, taken up with somebody and separated. So I suppose the things that I would observe in terms of like people who are in maybe a longer term partnership would be, I suppose, there's the kind of very fundamental stuff like the actual living setup, that oftentimes people find themselves in very compromised situations for financial reasons. Maybe they're sharing space with somebody in two different sections of the house, access to children, all of that kind of stuff. And then there's, the whole, I suppose, because invariably you're going to mix in the same social circles, so there can be, fractures to friendships, all of that. And of course then, the big one, if there's like infidelity or betrayal of some description involved, then that obviously presents a whole lot of other challenges for people. And I suppose there's, the biggest thing is the emotional impact for people on any level. As I said, it's obviously going to be more pronounced in cases where you're, in a long-term partnership with somebody, and if there's lots of, other factors like children and whatever else involved. But it's essentially a rebuild of your life, when you find yourself in that situation. So there's a lot of kind of different complicating factors, I suppose, and it's to kind of navigate your life all over again, really.
Yeah, and reset
Yeah.
it. Because
Yeah.
even to go back to the first part of your answer there, I think a lot of people find themselves stuck under the same roof because of financial reasons initially, especially where you said if something is unexpected or the relationship is broken down suddenly, or maybe it had broken down long ago for one person, but the other person wasn't privy to that info.
Yeah.
And then suddenly for financial reasons, people are stuck under the same roof. I've known plenty of people that have been in that situation, but I met with somebody not too long ago who has been in that situation for years. And, there's children there, and for different reasons, sometimes it can be down to how long the court system takes. Sometimes it's down to the financial burden of trying to run two households. But dealing with that breakdown and that chaos and then having to interact on a daily basis, there's a lot
really
in
tough.
that, isn't there?
Really, really tough. Yeah. And I suppose it kind of, it tests people to their limit. It really does, because as you say, particularly if it's come as a shock to one person, and, if there's like in relationships where people know there's kind of like a progression towards the end and both parties are kind of aware, okay, this is just not working out. That's a completely different scenario than, for example, like that if somebody, ends up kind of in a new relationship, or whatever the case is, that presents a whole other different view on things.
Yeah, I was talking to someone the other day, and there's a website, or I don't know if it's a Facebook page or a website, but it's basically, are we dating the same guy or something like that for these people that are leading these kind of double lives, and for people to find out that kind of information that kind of way has got to be really difficult.
Yeah.
When it comes to rebuilding self-esteem after a significant, and I think we're talking about those significant relationships where you think your life is on one particular path, and then the atomic bomb goes off and you realize that you've got to reset, rebuild, find yourself again. What kind of tools, or what strategies can people use when they find themselves in that situation?
Yeah, really good question. So I suppose it's like if I kind of think back to my psychology research and whatever, I think it was somewhere around the late 60s, Kubler-Ross developed this. It was like a 5-stage model for people who are going through grief, and it was in the context of bereavement. But actually that same model is used in terms of relationship loss, because like that, loss is loss at the end of the day, whether it's romantic or otherwise. And invariably we go through the same stages, maybe at different paces or at different times, and it's certainly not linear. So his model of development was the first stage is betrayal, or denial. You're in complete denial about, is this actually happening? What's going on here? The next stage is anger, so obviously that's an understandable emotion. The next one is bargaining. So, entering that phase of, is there anything that we can do? Can we do anything to salvage this? The next stage is depression and sadness, so that whole grief part. And then the last stage is acceptance. But as I said, you can kind of bounce back and forth. It's not a linear progression. So there would have been this kind of, I suppose, a train of thought around the same time. There was what was called the grief work hypothesis. And that was that if people didn't kind of go through those particular stages of grief in a linear order, that they would be left with kind of significant long-term emotional damage or psychological damage. They've since kind of tossed that one out. They've rebuked that theory, and now it's essentially that grief, everyone has their own way of working through grief, and that what might work for you may not necessarily work for me, and that it's, as I said, it's non-linear. So you can go back and forth between, you might be maybe at a stage of in the sadness phase, for example, but you may very well bounce back then into the denial stage.
Or back to a bit of anger.
Yeah, absolutely. And interesting that
as
you say that.
As things unfold and are unpicked and,
100%. And funny enough, actually, oftentimes the emotion that's closest to the surface to anger is sadness. So when you're speaking to somebody, oftentimes if you scratch below the surface and they're presenting in a very angry way, but actually if you break that down, it's sadness actually is the emotion that's most closely linked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, as you said, it's not linear, but I think any of the people that I know that are going through something like this at the moment, it's very hard because they look for advice.
Yeah.
But it just takes time, doesn't it? It's something I always say to people, you can't go around it. You just have to go through it. And
Absolutely.
And it's great to have friends that can empathize with the situation and friends that you can vent to over a coffee or over a drink or whatever it is. But actually, each individual just has to navigate their own way through it.
Yeah, at their own pace, and that's exactly what I mentioned there about that there is no one way. You have to just allow yourself to experience all the different emotions. The whole spectrum of emotions, no matter how difficult they are, because that's actually how you're going to come out. That's how you're going to emerge on the other side. Yeah. And I suppose it's interesting actually to observe the differences like between men and women and how they, so
what would you observe as the differences?
So men are more inclined to obviously kind of bury themselves in things like addictions, that would be very prevalent. And women, I suppose, they're obviously prone to addiction as well, but I suppose they're, as we know, they're more talkers. I suppose they will be more inclined to kind of discuss it with a friend or to talk to somebody or to seek out a psychologist or a therapist, whereas men like that, oftentimes, not always, but, I don't mean to kind of generalise too much, but they do find it more difficult to open up to somebody. So then they can be left with all that emotion inside, and the quickest way to mask that emotion is through drink, drugs, whatever else,
Yeah, and then the other thing that's interesting is after after a significant relationship ends, you'll tend to see people, going back onto the dating scene, but maybe going back too early to the dating scene where they're not ready. So I saw something where I think it was to do with that website or that Facebook page, and I think one of the guys had put up that he was dating, but he was emotionally unavailable. So I'm talking about red flags.
Yeah.
So what do you see a range of things there? Do you think people should give a little time to kind of do their own healing first, or do you think it's a good distraction for them to kind of get out there and see what they've been missing out on for those years?
Yeah, probably. Well, again, everyone is so different, but probably not straight away. I mean, it's never kind of the best idea to kind of jump from one thing, unless in situations, I suppose, where like that, as we were talking about earlier, Donald, that there's more of an expected end, that the relationship has actually ran its course. In that case, somebody might be more ready to actually meet somebody new, so that the pace might be a little bit more accelerated. But for situations where, it's been a really sudden breakdown, that's never really a good time to kind of go out hunting for something new, because you haven't kind of healed from the trauma that you've been left with as a result of the relationship that has broken down. So I suppose it's always good to kind of give yourself that time and space to kind of reflect and reframe and be able to kind of build yourself back up.
Yeah, that rebuild is interesting, isn't it? Because there's often the connection between the emotional and the physical rebuild. Yeah. And you tend to see people doing that a lot, where they're kind of, it's almost like that Control-Alt-Delete thing where they say, right, I'm actually going to get back for a run or get back running or get back to the gym and kind of invest in myself. And so what do you recommend if somebody's going through that kind of chaotic phase or that phase of just trying to reconnect with themselves or reset? What do you think are some good kind of strategies or good tools for people to focus on? Obviously not drinking drugs.
Well, I mean, the occasional glass of wine, whatever, I suppose everything in moderation. Yeah, except moderation itself, or even moderation itself, isn't that the expression? But so I think, and again, it's funny because like that, oftentimes people will be directed to go to talk therapy of some description if they've gone through. But it doesn't always, even though I'm a psychologist myself, but it actually doesn't always, it's not the most effective method for everybody, Some males in particular, find that exercise, lifting weights, for example, might be just as effective for them. So you kind of have to find your own particular way. But I think in general, if I was to kind of give a to-do list of self-care, you know, post-breakup, it would be kind of to find the things that bring you back to yourself. Because oftentimes if you are in that type of a long-term relationship, what can happen for people is they almost lose a sense of their own identity because they've become so enmeshed in the relationship and in all the different factors around the relationship. So to pour back into yourself. So whether that's through meeting up with friends, getting back involved with a hobby maybe that you used to be into, exercise, you know, making sure that you're focused on a health investment in yourself, and not just physical health, but also brain health, you know, and by that I mean making sure that you're eating well, that, you know, you're getting out into fresh air, that you're, you know, stimulating yourself cognitively, that you're actually investing in yourself on every level, you know, and that's ultimately going to have benefits, you know, and payoffs in the longer term. And also, you know, it's about developing new habits, because our brains are kind of conditioned to be quite habitual. So when we become used to a certain pattern or a certain interaction style with somebody, we have to develop a brand new one when we find ourselves in these situations of, you know, a relationship breakup, where all of a sudden you're solo. So
because it's a new identity, isn't it? Because it's
absolutely.
usually, you know, the two people's names are said together, and they're
Christmas
almost
cards, the
they're
lot.
referred to
Yeah.
as almost as an individual.
Yeah.
And I think the point there about, you know, not just fitness but reconnecting with things. You see a lot of people saying, "Oh, you know, I used to love playing the piano, or I used to
Yeah.
paint, or I used to do X,
Yeah.
Y, and Z." And getting back to that, and it's almost kind of reconnecting with your former self
Exactly.
to find what the next iteration or the next chapter is going to be like, isn't
Yeah.
it?
100%. Yeah.
In terms of rebuilding self-esteem, because if we take the scenario, as you mentioned, sometimes there's betrayal or there's infidelity or there's something like that happens, that has a real knock on somebody's confidence and their self-esteem. Any tips for people that need to rebuild that self-esteem?
Again, I probably sound like I'm repeating myself here, but it is an investment in self-care, you know, and I was going to say self-love, but that's probably a stretch too far when you're in that kind of a scenario, you know. So it really is just rebuilding yourself on every level and, you know, doing the things that you know have worked for you in the past. So oftentimes, like when I'm speaking to somebody, I'll ask them, you know, well, you know, and if you can think of a similar situation in your life where the chips have been down, or it may not necessarily have been a relationship breakup, but some really difficult experience, maybe you lost a loved one, you know, through death or whatever else. How did you rebuild yourself at that time? And oftentimes that will give you clues in terms of the person's resilience and in terms of the skills and resources that they've used in the past that have worked effectively. You know, because sometimes, you know, people can get stuck. You know, they can get stuck like that in that 5-part kind of stage that I talked about earlier. They can get stuck in one phase. So they might get stuck on the anger, or they might get stuck on the sadness and depression. And it's to kind of, you know, help them to recognize, okay, it's now 4 years post breakup. We really need to kind of look at, you know, your living style, you know, what you're doing to help yourself, you know, because oftentimes like that, some people can kind of just transition from one negative scenario into a brand new negative scenario, you know, where they're actually doing damage to themselves, you know. So,
Yeah. And some of that as well can be the fault of, if you think about marriages, some of that can be the fault of the judicial system because it takes so long. You know, if it's a significant relationship that breaks up, that isn't a contractual relationship, it's not a marriage.
Yeah.
You know, there's a certain period of time that process can take. But I think the challenge in this country, and it's great now that we've gone from the 4 years living separately apart to 2 years living separately and apart, but we still see cases where some of these divorces go on for years and years, and it actually almost forces people to be stuck in that pattern of conflict and negotiation and so on. So
and a replay of the same thoughts, you know, every day, which again, you know, like we all hear of how much our thoughts impact us on a day-to-day basis, and what we focus on is who we become. So if that stuff is in your head 24/7, think of the impact that's going to do, not only to your psyche, but to your well-being, So you're kind of, there's a lot of different factors that you're juggling.
Yeah, definitely. So to turn it on its head, for people that want to, say, for example, they're not at that stage, but, relationships take work, whether friendships or intimate relationships. What are your tips and advice for people that want to really invest in the relationship and maintain healthy relationships?
So again, you can't kind of pour from an empty cup. So always the first, but even though it sounds selfish to so many people that you have to pour into yourself first, but I sing this, that, in order to present the best version of yourself, to give the best version of yourself to others, you have to pour into yourself first. It just doesn't work otherwise. So
it's like that thing of looking for somebody else to make you happy, isn't it? You've got to be happy in your own skin and bring that version of yourself to the relationship.
Yeah, 100%. The other thing I'd say is, to recognize that we're all imperfect, like, by nature. So it's, while there's red flags, even in the most amazing relationships, there's going to be a certain amount of red flags, but it's to figure out what your deal breakers are, So while it might necessarily be a deal breaker that your partner leaves, I don't know, their dirty laundry on the floor, but it may be a
Can we edit that bit out?
Just saying. Okay.
Oh, I'm going to get grief for this. No, go on.
But
that would be a red flag, but not a deal breaker. Can I get that as a professional opinion?
But to give like an ultimate deal breaker, again, we're back to kind of the likes of betrayal, infidelity, like, so that might be a complete no. So the other stuff, it's to kind of know what stuff you can throw over your shoulder and what stuff is going to absolutely break the relationship. The other thing, I suppose, is to make time for each other. Like, you've heard me talking about Esther Perel before on this, Donal. She's fantastic, and anyone who hasn't read any of her books, she's done some great work on relationships and whatever else. But she talks about the three things in particular from her years of work with clients in the relationship field, and it's like where she has asked clients, like, when are you kind of most in love or desire your partner most? Okay. And the first thing is when they're in their prime, as in when they're in a flow state. So when they're doing something that they're really good at, and you're kind of almost watching on as an observer, it kind of takes people back to the early stages of the relationship, where there's that kind of that elusivity almost about that person, because you almost feel a sense of pride that's that's my partner, that's my girl or my man, whatever the case is. The other thing is when there's shared emotion, in particular laughter, so no surprises there. So when you feel that sense of that you're sharing the same experience, or that you're laughing at the same stuff, basically, that's that can increase desire for people hugely as well. And the other thing is when there's a longing created, so maybe that's through distance, maybe if you haven't seen somebody in a while, that generates desire as well. So it's to kind of, I suppose, in relationships, it's kind of, you're all the time trying to create, because obviously relationships by their nature, they create, well, hopefully what you're looking for is safety, an element of security. But there also needs to be an element of desire, unpredictability, playfulness, in order for the right chemistry really to take place. So it's to not forget to invest in those pieces as well, and that's why it can often be the ruination of a relationship when people become complacent and they forget the very things that made them attracted to their partner to begin with, so it's to make time for each other, to make time for sexual intimacy, and to not be afraid to talk about it, because like that, so many people get into ruts, and that is, unfortunately, one of the reasons that people end up, going their separate ways because that desire piece, becomes elusive.
Yeah. And it's human nature, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the relationships start with, as you said, usually that spark of attraction and then when you move to companionship and kids get involved and the reality of financial pressures and all the different things. So it is about actually having the discipline to invest time and invest in all that, the reasons that people are together. We had a fantastic episode last week with Lyra, and she was talking about her recent single. And one of the things that she put up, because it's a breakup song, one of the things that she said, which I thought was incredibly insightful, is that remember that your ex is your ex for a reason. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. So simple, but so true, and that, I also, I don't know, was it on a podcast or something I read recently, but it was like, somebody was asking the question, is it ever good to get back with an ex? And it must have been a podcast actually, and whoever it was that guy, Dr. K, I think he's a Harvard professor or something. He was saying, only go back with an ex if you are going to resolve the issues that actually broke the relationship to begin with. So if you're
You'd
not
have
prepared
to
to work
imagine-
on that stuff, forget it.
You'd have to imagine the probability of success has to be pretty low. I don't know if there's any research or data to track rebounds, but I wouldn't guess that it's in high figures.
Yeah, I can't give you the exact figures, but I do know, and again, this is back to, I'm always quoting her because she's done some fantastic research. Esther Perel would say that actually, a considerably higher number than you'd expect of like that, where there's been a misdemeanor or where there's been infidelity, that actually it can work, and that infidelity is, it's something that's kind of, I suppose it's a global phenomenon, and it's not going away. Like, it's always going to be there, so sometimes it can be better to work on and to figure out, okay, well, what were the issues that broke us, rather than thinking that running to the next person is going to solve. Because at some point, and that's the thing, like when there is a relationship breakdown, both people have to look at their stuff, because it's never just one person, Both people have to look to see, okay, well, in what way was I responsible? Whereas the natural thing to do in relationships is to point the finger of blame to the other person and to think that if that person did X, Y, and Z, then the relationship would be happy. But actually, the first place is always with yourself. You have to look at your own stuff to see, okay, in what way am I contributing to negative patterns? And how do I stop those patterns, so that I become a better version of myself in the next relationship, or if I choose to go back to the one that I was already in.
I think that's really powerful, but I would imagine that would be an easier thought process to go through with somebody like a therapist or a counsellor, because I'd imagine when it comes to apportioning blame and the ability to self-reflect and see
really
your
tough.
part, it's a difficult thing to do, especially going through those kind of difficult times of rebuilding. Talk to me a little bit about balance and balancing some tools that people can use to balance their personal relationships and their professional kind of career, because I think a lot of this can play into not putting the time into the relationship because of the demands of daily life. So have you any insight into trying to find that balance?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky balance, isn't it? And I think it's becoming like actually more difficult for people, because there seems to be more and more entrepreneurs and people who, are developing their own businesses and whatever else. And I think because that is an investment in yourself to a certain extent, oftentimes what you'll find is people will describe, well, I don't mind, working 70 hours a week because it's my own business and whatever else. But I suppose it's to recognise that it is going to be at the cost of something else if you choose to do that. So, it is looking for that fine balance between, investing in your personal life and also being happy with the level of investment in your professional life as well. And I don't think it's an easy balance for anybody, And I know we talk a lot about work-life balance, but I think it's probably easier for people who don't particularly like their jobs. I think for people who enjoy their jobs, it's actually more difficult for them to pull back.
Yeah.
You know, they want to kind of spend the time, and sometimes it can be a way of, you know, getting away from the relationship as well. If
Yeah.
you're working a 70-hour a week, you know.
Definitely. And then there's the challenge of technology and phones and emails and all that kind of stuff, and that lack of demarcation between personal life and,
Yeah.
and business life
Yeah.
is a real challenge, which is a lovely segue to get into technology.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I want to talk to you about is, okay, we'll take the scenario where somebody's gone through the big breakup or the significant relationship breakup. They've put some time into themselves. They've got to the point where they're happy in their own skin. And then they're down to, okay, they might have been in a relationship for 5, 10, 15, 20 years more. And now they realize they are in the dating app world. What are your views? Dating apps versus real life, pros and cons?
Yeah.
Because that's the one thing everyone says when you say, you know, how's it going? Are you on the apps? And they're like, yeah, the world has changed and not for the better is what I usually hear.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, you know, they get a bad rap, dating apps, and you know, but I always say, like, what's the alternative? Because, you know, you're not as predisposed to kind of meeting people as you would have done, you know, maybe 10 years ago or whatever.
No slow sets anymore?
No. But you're just not. So I suppose it's about kind of, you know, using discernment when you're on dating apps. And I suppose, you know, oftentimes I think what happens to people is the longer that they're on dating apps, the more it's almost like this perception that there's like this factory that are where these ready-made people come out and that they're the perfect product. They're not. Like they might appear like that on the screen, but like, you know, often that's far from the reality when you meet somebody in person. So I suppose while I'm absolutely in favour of putting yourself out there, and, you know, obviously I always say, like, whoever it is, they're not going to come knocking on your door. You know, it's not like a DPD delivery. Like, you have to get out there and apply the same amount of effort and energy into your dating life as you do with everything else, you know. But it's to kind of, you know, I suppose just be discerning in terms of how you approach them, because what you see is not always what you get, and you kind of just need to be careful in terms of, you know, giving out your number and stuff like that, and checking the facts, you know. Because, you know, oftentimes I'd hear like guys talking about, oh, you know, girls, they're also, they filter their pictures and they, you know, they don't give full length pictures of themselves and whatever. Guys do the same thing. Maybe they're not as guilty on the filter front, but they'll also, you know, only present one particular angle of themselves. So it's kind of been, if you choose to go on a dating app, try to present the version of yourself that's as authentic as possible, because otherwise the person that you meet is going to get a fright, you know?
Yeah. And a really good point was made by Dr. Lolly Mancy when she was in for her episode, and she was talking about the fact, well, you've got to look at the dating apps. You know, they're a business and they're a subscription service, and their goal is to keep you on the apps rather than for you to find that great person and to live kind of happily ever after, for want of a better way of putting it. And so I think there's definitely challenges with it, and there's also challenges with the different way that I think men and women potentially approach it. Like I know some, I'll say a former friend who used to like he would sit and just kind of for those people that are watching, he used to just kind of, you know, do all this right swiping with one hand and then go through and unmatch as he'd kind of, you know, kind of get to the other end of things. He used to do that on during work, so he's no longer with that particular company. But there's also that kind of mismatch between, you know, how discerning people are and, you know, how they present themselves. And, you know, so there's a lot with it. I'd be far more of an advocate for the old school real world,
Yeah, I mean,
meeting somebody that you have a connection with rather than
yeah,
you
and
know,
I
that
think even
superficial
with the
thing.
apps, try to meet somebody as early as possible. Like, don't do the whole endless texting, or even do a phone call, because you'll be able to tell a lot more from somebody's voice within the first couple of minutes, than just texting, messaging over and back. So to meet somebody in person, I think that's do that quickly, as opposed to, as I said, endless texting, which may not end up anywhere anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in terms of, I suppose, people then that want to put themselves out as being, say, for example, on the dating apps and presenting themselves as an authentic version of themselves, do you think it's just about transparency and honesty, or what can people do to?
Yeah, well, I think for starters, like, put a bit of thought into your profile, because I think like that, a lot of people just, it appears that they just kind of throw up anything. And so I think it's good to, and that it's an honest representation of yourself, both visually and in terms of what you write about yourself, so that you're not false advertising, you're giving whoever it is, an insight into potentially who you might be. And, as I said, then when you meet somebody in person, I think a lot of us are probably very invested in the spark and the chemistry and seeing if that's there. But I suppose you also have to remember that, dating doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. A lot of people can be quite nervous on first dates, and they may not perform at their best, because it is kind of a performance, if you think about it. It's an audition essentially for, like, it is quite surreal.
It's like a job interview, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah. But like, even that, I think, steer away from. I know if you're to watch, like, some of the American TikTokers, like, they'll talk about, like, it should be like literally an interview where you're finding out stuff, whereas I wouldn't be of that school of thought at all, because I think that if you put somebody under that kind of pressure, you're never going to get the best version of them, whereas if, certainly for the first meeting, if there's a more kind of a natural flow where you just allow the conversation to go wherever it goes, you get a more genuine sense, and plus you put them at ease.
Yeah. So leave the checklist at home.
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
It is. It's a difficult time, I think, for people, but I think that the good news is there is light at the end of the tunnel, and there are decent people out there still. Yeah. It's just a different way of getting to the result, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, going back to your own podcast, give us an idea of some of the, obviously you did the first episode yourself, where you kind of talked through a little bit about the thinking behind it and the topics you're likely to cover. What type of guests are you going to sit down and chat with as well?
Yeah, I suppose people with kind of interests or specialisms in the areas that I'm hoping to chat about. So, like, things like relationships again, dating, confidence, imposter syndrome, addiction, and overcoming addiction, entrepreneurship, what else? Kind of family dynamics, friendships, attachment styles, because they can be a big impactor as well in terms of relationships, and how relationships kind of play out, because we all have different attachment styles. And, they can be the cause of a lot of conflict in relationships if we're not aware of the different attachment styles and how they can impact grief, bereavement, things like that. So, as I said, kind of, I suppose, extensions of the themes that I spoke about in my book, just to kind of go into a little bit more depth and to give voice to them, as opposed to just the written word.
I think it's going to be a great support for people, because there's a real element of personal development. There's a real, and this is the thing that I personally love about podcasts. It's just access to just this broader view of information in an accessible and grounded way. So I'm really looking forward to more of the
Thanks a million,
episodes coming
Dawn.
out.
I've got one fan.
Yeah,
great.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, looking forward to it. Look, I just want to say thanks again for coming back in, being the first returning guest. Really appreciate it, and for making the trip to
I'm
the Big
really
Smoke.
honoured. Thanks a million, Dawn.
Yeah, no, it's an absolute pleasure. And we will share your Instagram and the details about the book and the podcast
Super.
in the show notes. And the very best of luck with it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks a million,
great.
Dawn.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks a million.
And if you've enjoyed the podcast, you can subscribe to our YouTube. You can follow our Instagram. They're both at talentmatters_podcast. And as I said, we'll add Dr. Denise's socials to the show notes. So you'll be able to find her there. And thanks again to our sponsor, Sanderson. And we'll see you next time.